but what would be a response or a typical kind of like way of thinking you would respond to somebody in that way of like, hey, is low carb the only option I have right now? Because people are making it seem like blood sugar responses, insulin resistance, and micromanaging my blood sugar after every single meal is like the most important thing for health. Like, what are some things that come to mind for you of like why that might not be the best way of thinking at the end of the day?
That is a really great question. So there's a number of ways that we can approach that, but for our purposes, I would maybe give it a two-part answer. So the first part would be explaining to the person that the human organism is perfectly capable of metabolizing carbohydrate in substantial amounts, just as it is perfectly capable of metabolizing fat and protein in substantial amounts. Now, where the problems start to occur is if on a chronic basis we're running an unused caloric surplus. In other words, a caloric surplus that's not used towards building lean tissue, then we start having a problem because we start accumulating body fat through the various depots in the body. And you and I know that after a certain point, you start courting you start taking chances with the type of genetics you have for accumulating body fat in the visceral slash ectopic space, and then beginning the process of cardiometabolic disease through intermediate mechanisms like increases in insulin resistance. So I would I wouldn't say exactly that to the layperson. I would just say, look, we humans can metabolize carbohydrate just fine. But what we don't do well with is over consuming total calories by the end of the day or by the end of the week and stringing a bunch of weeks and months like this together to the point where we accumulate excess total body fat. That's what we don't do well with. And then the second part of my answer would be low carbohydrates can work well for controlling body weight, and they do work well for a lot of people for controlling body weight. But it's not for the reason that you are reducing carbohydrate per se. So when somebody carb restricts to whatever degree it might be, whether it's a ketogenic degree where you're topping out at 50 grams of total carbohydrates per day, or whether it's just some sort of floating and abstract, oh, I'm going to cut back on my carbs type of approach. Anytime you do that, well, yes, carbohydrate is going to go down and you're going to be replacing some of that carbohydrate with dietary fat. But what almost always happens, especially when somebody in the lay public goes from the standard Western diet to either keto or some level of carb restriction, is a substantial increase in protein intake and sometimes a doubling of protein intake compared to their habitual protein intake. And what that does is increases satiety. So they have greater hunger and craving control. And they ultimately end up eating fewer calories by the end of the day. So it really does all come back to energy balance, even if you take an approach of going low carb or going keto. And people tend to overlook the power of increases in protein combined with the narrowing of your options for carb, fat combo, highly refined, ultra processed junk foods. So when people say, I'm going to cut carbs, what they don't realize is they're also cutting a certain amount of fat out of their diet because they're cutting out these highly engineered, highly refined and processed carb fat combo junk foods that can be very problematic if there are no sort of controls or top speed limiter on how much of that stuff you consume. So low carb diets do work, but not necessarily for the reasons people think they do. Because um, and the whole carbohydrate insulin model thing, that's a thing that nerdy folks are aware of, and that's something that people argue back and forth about in the enthusiast space as well as the academic space. But essentially, it paints carbs out to be the bad guy because, in quotes, because insulin, BUHC UZ because insulin. That's just a silly thing. It's incredibly silly because there have been multiple studies done now where we equate protein and total calories and we compare highly disparate proportions of carbohydrate and fat between the two diets. Same body fat loss as long as protein and calories are controlled and equated. So while I do empathize with the lay public seeking a simple solution, and guess what? Avoiding carbs is a simple solution, but it leads people into these false information rabbit holes that ultimately can sabotage them. So it leads people into thinking, okay, well, carbs are bad. Carbs are going to make me fat. Therefore, let's see what foods have carbs. Okay, obviously, the added sugar I was eating, those donuts I was eating, they have carbs. Oh, yeah, fruit has carbs. Oh man, fruit is mostly sugar. I've got to cut those out. Yeah, potatoes have carbs. Beans. They're a pain in the butt. I don't like them anyway. Oh, they have carbs. Good, I'll kick them out. So they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater from a long-term health standpoint, unnecessarily too. And it's just kind of a silly thing to watch, and it just takes a little bit of education to be able to help people understand that yes, you can have carbs in your diet as long as your protein and total calories are right, and you have a very wide range of carb to fat ratio that is basically going to have the same effect on body weight and body composition. So you have to find what you prefer and what you can actually adhere to in the long term. And that is kind of the secret. Um, so, yeah, there are different elements that people need to be educated on. It's just hard to actually answer in a soundbite like saying carbs are bad, avoid them. And the reality of the matter is when you tell somebody carbs are bad, avoid them, most people will be able to do that for a finite period of time, and then they crash and burn, and then they yo-yo and they just try it again, and then the cycle repeats. And it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, super well said. I was just nodding my head to every word you just said there. And I can't help but think too, again, going back to the average person who might be listening to this podcast, who doesn't have a huge, foundation for nutrition reason. And not to say that you need to even have, a basic backbone of like what nutrition research says and everything, but just a baseline level of like being able to critically think about certain things. When people hear this kind of concept of like, hey, prevalence of type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance has gone up tenfold in X amount of time, right? And people are more metabolically unhealthy or unfit. And we have this epidemic of people who are, resistant to insulin or having this baseline level of insulin resistance. And that could lead to things like kidney disease or, in conjunction with blood pressure and hyperlipidemia and all these other like metabolic complications. We have all of these things that are going on. And then you get somebody out there or multiple people or a shit ton of people out there. Well, it's like, well, let's think about this, right? Well, if our body can't tolerate carbs that we're eating, it has to be the carbs that are at fault for the reasons why these systems are broken. And then that logic or that level, of thinking then translate to, okay, well, let's cut out all of the carbohydrate foods. Let's try to micromanage our blood sugar responses after meals, right? Because we know if our blood sugar goes up, then having high blood sugar over the lifespan is not a good thing, right? So those two have to be correlated when at the end of the day, these acute physiological, responses to our meals, that does not equate to you having a super high A1C over the long term, right? But it's not very sexy to say that. And it's very easy to create this narrative around why fructose, why avoiding added sugars, why not eating anything with carbohydrates might be in your best interest. And people buy into that because on the surface, it kind of makes sense, right? And that's the hard part about nutrition is like there's bits and truths and a lot of the things, right? Of problems that people might be struggling with. But the problem is it's not, one independent variable that's influencing everything, right? There's a laundry list of other confounding variables that people aren't even accounting for, but it leads them down this road of like, okay, I'm unhealthy. My A1C is 8. I need to stop eating carbs because that's the thing that's driving my A1C up or my blood sugar after meals. And then before you know it, they're not eating carbs. They're getting a CGM. They're, trying to, hyper manage these physiological systems that, let's be real, are meant to fluctuate at the end of the day, right? And for me, in my opinion, at least, it's at best a distraction from a lot of the other things that they could be doing, right? Or I just can't sit here and say that somebody with a high A1C, that has to be your primary focus, is to lower your A1C, when in reality, managing your lifestyle, understanding energy balance, understanding like, hey, if I lose 5% of my body weight, if I have weight to lose, like that can improve a lot of these markers. How can I start exercising more? Am I getting daily activity? And you talked about alcohol earlier. Like, what's my alcohol consumption like? How many meals am I cooking at home? Like, focusing your time, attention, and energy to those things is going to likely improve your A1C. It's likely going to improve a lot of these other things that you're looking for. But just trying to micromanage like what your blood sugar is, for example, is just a poor allocation of people's like finite amount of like mental energy they could put towards their health and their fitness. Because let's be real, people are busy. They have kids, they have lives, they have work. They don't need to know the nuances and science around all of this stuff. So really, a distraction is at best is what I'm thinking of, but at worst it could lead to, as we both know, right, like orthorexia or disordered eating patterns or eating disorders, and that can have a laundry list of things that is not desirable for a person, if not corrected or at least informed in a level-headed way, instead of making these things out to be the end all be all for health.
Yeah, very well said. The whole glucose, in quotes, glucose spike fear is one of the silliest things that's made it to the internet and got spread around, and that some people have actually bought into. Um, why not just be concerned about, in quotes, spikes in your circulating fatty acids? Why not be concerned about spikes in certain amino acid levels? Why not try to track all three of those things simultaneously? And really, it's just different layers of insanity. People just don't understand that the body is perfectly fine with, in quotes, glucose spikes, but it's not fine with an excess of total caloric intake by the end of the day and the end of the week, ongoing on a chronic basis, to the point where you accumulate excess body fat, excess visceral fat, and then start the cascade towards cardiometabolic diseases. It's harder to see that big picture than it is to see the little picture of, oh, I got to minimize my glucose spike, so I have to eat my meals in this certain neurotic order. Absolutely not. And that is absolutely false. And some people will be happy to hear that it's false, and some people will be mad to hear that it's false. And so we have to speak to the latter group, who just doesn't understand how human physiology works, and they are simply unaware of the body of literature examining this topic and examining the topic of carb restriction and blood glucose control. And now the succession of systematic reviews and meta-analyses showing that very strict, very aggressive carb restriction is not significantly superior to a more moderate carb consumption for controlling blood sugar and even for managing things like type 2 diabetes. And it comes down to educators conveying this stuff in an empathetic way and realizing that people want to hear something simple and something exciting. They don't want to hear, hey, you can have X amount of carbs. Let's throw some numbers up. You don't have to limit your carbs to 50 grams a day in order to be perfectly healthy from a glycemic control standpoint for the rest of your life. If you're pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic, then the literature indicates roughly this threshold of about 130 grams of carbohydrates, below which there can be benefit, but it's tough to adhere to in the long term. But you can still do well managing around 130 grams of total carbohydrate a day as a type 2 diabetic. And it's those little details that maybe people could bite onto a little bit better. And then there's the kind of the practical things for long-term health that people need to understand, that, look, if you're somebody who gravitates towards a ketogenic diet, and you enjoy it, or you're pursuing it because you feel you have issues with blood sugar, then you have to pay special attention to the food selection, where the majority of your calories are coming from and what they're going to do to your cardiovascular health over time. Otherwise, you're fixing or trying to control one problem while creating another long-term problem from a cardiovascular health standpoint. So yeah, there's different roads to go down with the topic of carb restriction and glucose control, but people just simply don't understand that with type 2 diabetes, what really and truly forms the foundation of mitigating it, putting it into remission and or reversing it, is simply getting substantially leaner from a body fat percent standpoint. And you really should do whatever it takes to be able to adhere to the plan, to be able to maintain that type of energy balance and that type of program in order to stay as lean as you need to be in order to mitigate the adverse effects of excess body fat on blood glucose control. And there are many, many, many roads to Rome in terms of getting leaner. It doesn't have to be a carb restriction approach. It doesn't have to be a fat restriction approach, but it does have to be what you can stick to. And there's a lot of good research by Roy Taylor's group and other groups in the peer-reviewed literature showing that there is a wide range of macronutrient distributions, well, carb fat proportions in particular, that work for improving glycemic control as long as the subjects lose a substantial amount of body weight. And by body weight, I mean body fat. And there's also a growing body of literature showing that, interestingly, resistance training is a little more potent at improving blood glucose control than aerobic training is, even though it's understood that the ideal is being able to do some combination of both types. So when you have the objective of, for example, going from, let's say as a male, going from 30% body fat to 15% body fat, and you have the objective to do that with a combination of resistance and aerobic type training, or if you want to mash it together, you can do a hybrid. You can do resistance training that's aerobically oriented and still get the same effects. And then you make sure your food selection is high quality for the most part, and the carb fat proportion that you take in is something that you can actually stick to, and even something that you might look forward to so you can stick to it better. And with that set of goals in mind, that's really kind of the nutshell formula for improving blood glucose control. It's not stopping the postprandial glucose spikes or the post-meal glucose spikes for people who are unfamiliar with that term. It's just about getting leaner in the healthiest and most sensible way possible that you can stick to in the long term. And other little nuances to that are making sure you have enough protein so you can support lean body mass while you're losing body fat. And there's a lot of elements to it. And once again, Luke, I wish I could say there was a simple way to put this, but there isn't. And that's why these conversations are great.
For sure. And I think you put that as simply put as could be, given a 10-minute, little monologue on a podcast episode. But I'm happy you brought up a few things. One thing is not, I mean, we all know the importance of exercise in having more muscle or having a decent amount of muscle mass in resistance training. Doing some cardio is great, but like, if we look at like insulin sensitivity, like the impacts that exercise can have on that, like independent from diet alone, is pretty exciting, and a lot of time that's not people's first like route of thinking, is like, how can I increase my activity if I'm not doing any at all? Or how can I change the style of exercise that I'm doing to something that might maybe be more conducive? And all exercise is great, but if you look at something like resistance training, if we look at like muscles are the largest disposal site of glucose in our body, right? And so having more of that can make your insulin sensitivity improve alone. Not to mention the utilization of that energy as we are exercising and doing that routinely throughout the course of the week within different exercise modalities, sure. But like thinking about, can I get protein in at every meal? Can I start to limit the amount of processed food that I'm eating, which I think is a great recommendation for a lot of people? Can I increase my activity? Can I get, instead of 2,000 or 3,000 steps a day, can I get to 7 or 8? Can I lift for 30 minutes, twice a week? All of these things that are going to have profound health, improvements more than somebody slapping on a CGM and tracking whether or not the mission tortilla that they had brought their, blood sugar from 90 to 160, within a 30-minute stretch. So those are the things that I'm like, I just laugh because they make sense from a marketing standpoint, and people are getting, $50, $60 kickbacks from selling all these CGMs online. But what you brought up initially when you started talking is like, if you have that logic of thinking, that should apply in all areas, right? And so if you have that person who's saying low carb is best, don't eat as many carbs, try and minimize your blood sugar response, because if we have a high A1C, if we have high blood sugar over the long term, that's a bad thing. Well, so is having super high triglycerides, for example, right? But what happens after we eat a higher fat meal? Our post meal triglyceride content is going to go up within the blood. So that same logic applies to, people who are doing the low carb, the keto group. They're having their ribeye with their avocado, with their half a cube of butter slathered on top, with their eggs, and, with whatever else they're putting on their fucking wooden cutting board that you see on Instagram all these days. And it's like, well, what if they, and I don't think people have the resources to do that, but like the same logic should apply, but that thing goes missed in pursuit of projecting this other information onto people. So I'm really happy you brought that up, because a lot of times it's people just nitpicking or picking and choosing what they want to believe, and then doubling down on it and selling stuff that, might be in their monetary gain, unfortunately, which is a reality that, a lot of people on social media might be partaking in. So I, yeah, I laugh because there's so many things around this stuff. And like you said, it's not super simple, but it can be more simple for people, instead of trying to overcomplicate things all the time. So I'm really happy you put that way. The fat thing cracks me up. We have 5 minutes left. Do you mind if I just ask one question on seed oil? It's going to be impossible.
Fire away.
Yeah, but
Fire away.
it brings me up because another polarizing kind of area of discussion in the nutrition space now is seed oils, especially with the emergence of like the, primal style of eating or animal based diets, or people in general just kind of shitting on seed oils. And uh, this whole, yeah, like carnivore diet has kind of brought this to surface a little bit more. But seed oils, there's been a lot of fear mongering around it. I guess to simply ask a question around it is, are seed oils something that we should be avoiding at all costs? Um, or just like, and not to make this a leading question, it, is it possible to include them, or is the fear around them irrational or not super truthful that you might be hearing from different camps, to the point where they can be included in a healthy diet, or they are something that maybe we shouldn't be putting all of our eggs into this one basket trying to avoid at all costs? Like, where is your stance on seed oils and how that's kind of emerged as really the primary topic of conversation? Because there's a lot of people out there right now who will go on this tangent of like, seed oils were used for motor oil and they were on the shelves in the motor stores and now they were inserted in food. And you look at a beach at, with the 1960s and everyone's skinny, and then you look at a beach in Florida nowadays and everyone's overweight or obese. And what's the trend? It's like seed oils have gone up and obesity have gone up. So if so facto, that's the thing that has led to the obesity epidemic. Like, is it really that simple? Or like, what would be your response to somebody who's kind of dispelling that information and wanting to paint that as the biggest bad guy now?
Yeah, wow. Okay, this is a great topic. So I might talk for a little bit longer than you might anticipate. So just
Good.
hang on, bear with me for a second. So seed oils are just the latest in a cyclical scapegoating of a single factor that is supposedly causing the ills of humanity. So in the 1980s, it was dietary fat, period. So there was a fat-free version of absolutely everything in the 1980s. in the peripheral aisles, or actually all over, like throughout the entire supermarket, not just the center aisles. Like everything was fat free. Like everything was trying to tout itself as fat free. Even things that have been fat free since the beginning of time, like Kool-Aid, was touting fat free. It's like, wow. Okay, so fat is the bad guy now, I suppose. That was the 1980s for anybody who's old enough to have lived through it. And so what happened in the 1990s was carbs were the bad guy. Any carbs in any form. So low carb dieting, ketogenic diet, the Atkins diet experienced a resurgence in popularity in the 90s. And so people started viewing carbs en masse as the bad guy. And then in the 2000s, people started getting a little bit more savvy. It was a little bit boring to call all carbs the bad guy because, hey, we couldn't really deny that fruits and vegetables and certain higher fiber types of carbs, like whole grains and or legumes and tubers, root vegetables. We couldn't really deny that those things were pretty healthy, and we couldn't really deny that people on the paleo diet were experiencing kind of a renaissance there, despite eating carbs. So maybe carbs aren't the bad guy. It's sugar. Yeah, sugar's the bad guy. Yep, yep. So in 2000s, sugar was the bad guy. So when we go another decade, into the 2010s, a bunch of really wacky and funny things started happening, but the seed oils thing started picking up steam. So we started running out of scapegoats. So, and eventually we would, we would vilify protein to a small degree in recent years. But now we're on seed oils. Okay, so through the 2000s, there was this kind of deification of certain fatty acid types, like omega-3 fatty acids, and then people were really truly fear mongering about saturated fats and trans fats and things like that. And so now our vilification has gone towards, oh, seed oils. Seed oils of all things, the mundane and inert seed oils. And that's because people need a scapegoat to point to, a single factor, a smoking gun, to blame on the ills of humanity. And seed oils is the current flavor of the decade. And the reason why that is particularly silly is because, number one, it's a ridiculous oversimplification. There's at least 12 different kinds of seed oils circulating commercially. It's saying seed oils are bad is analogous to saying dairy is bad. Okay, what kind of dairy, what dose, what context are we talking? Or how about this? Meat is bad. Animal food's bad. If you say meat is bad or dairy is bad, that's almost the exact equivalent of saying seed oils are bad. What freaking seed oil are we talking about? Number one, because there's a dozen of them out there. And what dose, what context, and what health outcome are you saying that is being affected adversely? And what research do you have to back this up? So if you ask somebody the battery of questions, if somebody pops online and says seed oils are bad, then I say, okay, let's kind of like let's have a productive discussion here. Number one, specify the seed oil, please. Number two, specify the health outcome that you're concerned about the seed oil affecting. Number three, please share the human trial that you feel best supports your concern. The conversation is over, like just done and over. Every once in a while, you'll find somebody with a little bit of reading under their belt. Some people read just enough to be, in quotes, dangerous, and then they'll cite something like, well, the Minnesota coronary experiment showed that switching out for, saturated fats and polyunsaturated fats increased cardiovascular disease and mortality. And this was a really big study. And, da, da, da. And then the response to that is, oh, you mean that study that was done half a century ago in psychiatric patients with a non-continuous stay? That study? Yeah, I guess so. Okay, well, how about the current totality of the evidence? Number one. And number two, you didn't specify which seed oil. You didn't specify the health outcome, and you tried with the Minnesota coronary experiment. How about the Sydney Diet Heart Study? How about that? Oh, well, that's got issues with it too. They didn't specify like where the sources of what the sources of PUFAs were, how much trans fats they could have had in the hydrogenated PUFAs, and they did a pretty poor job of tracking omega-3 sources like that from fish that might have made the outcomes more favorable in the non in the group that did not receive the vegetable oil treatment. So we can go into the weeds with specific studies if somebody is, in quotes, well versed enough to try to defend their position. But even when we go that route, you see these absolutely glaring, gaping holes with the research that they cite. And, but that rarely happens. Talking about the Minnesota coronary experiment and the Sydney Diet Heart Study, and, you know, raising the LA veteran study that showed the opposite of those things. It was much better controlled. Even before going down that route, you can ask somebody, okay, which seed oil concerns you the most? 9 times out of 10, they'll say, oh, well, canola oil. Duh. And then you can just say, all right, cool. What human research are you basing this opinion on? And then the conversation either ends with crickets or insults, or they can say, okay, well, let's have a look. I'm willing to take a look. And then you see a convergence of evidence from observational data and experimental data showing mostly positive and sometimes neutral effects of canola oil. And even in head to head comparisons with olive oil, canola oil outperforms it a little bit from these cardiovascular risk indicators. And but it's not all that surprising. I mean, canola oil has a higher proportion of omega-3 within it. And so that gives it an edge over other oils when you're comparing them for how they affect these blood biomarkers of health. And really, the seed oil thing, people who are also, a little more savvy and read enough to be dangerous will say, oh, okay, well, seed oils, they increase your omega-6 intake in the diet, you see, because linoleic acid is evil, you see. Oh, is that so? Okay, so what source are you talking about? And is it really linoleic acid? If we're to construct a diet, a healthy diet that contains linoleic acid from, let's say, nuts, let's say actual seeds. Did you know that walnuts have a crap ton of omega-6 linoleic acid? Try to find me the health threat of walnuts. Try to find me the health threat inherent with nuts as a group, as just a group of foods. You'll get a bunch of omega-6 from there. You get a bunch of linoleic acid from there. And then they just are kind of hit with the reality of the evidence that, oh, okay, maybe I oversimplified things and maybe I should focus a little bit more on the food source than hyper focusing on linoleic acid, let alone, seed oils as a group. And then maybe there's another side of the conversation where if you are getting a bunch of seed oil intake from deep fried foods at the local greasy spoon or from your local drive through, or if you're just eating out in restaurants all the time where they might be preparing food in constantly reheated soybean and or corn oil, you have much bigger problems than the actual seed oils that you're taking in, my friend. And so there's different avenues that conversation can go down. But if I were to just sort of break it down and try to distill it down to a little soundbite, maybe people who scaremonger over seed oils are oversimplifying the issue and they're unaware of the totality of evidence and they are missing the forest for the trees.
I think that was super well said, man. And I love the use of oversimplification throughout that whole little monologue you just had, because I think sitting here and sitting here as a consumer, and this is even a route that other people might take who might be arguing against some of these things, is the oversimplification of the other side, where it's like, okay, I hear Alan just do that whole little, rant on seed oils. Well, then you're promoting the consumption of seed oils at all costs, or you're somebody saying we should increase them, and we should have them in our diet at all costs or in higher amounts. And that's not what you're saying either, right? Like,
Mhm.
two things can be true at the same time here. Like, seed oils aren't harmful to your health, right? Or they aren't as harmful to your health. And a diet full of seed oils, diet full of processed foods, a diet rich in fast foods. You mentioned the oils that they never probably clean out, or clean out every so often, that they're using to deep fry a lot of these foods that you're eating. No fucking shit. That's not what we want for our health and longevity, and improving health outcomes. So those two things can be true at the same time, but it's just the context in which we're talking about some of these things, and compared to what, right? And asking some of these follow-up questions, and just being a little bit more of an educated kind of consumer, and not somebody who just defaults to whatever somebody is saying and then trying to act on that or implement that. I think the oversimplification of these things on both sides just creates this argument in the health and nutrition space around healthcare professionals or content creators that trickle down to the consumer, and people are more confused at the end of the day. So I'm really happy.
They're more confused. And
Yep.
what I think I can do to sort of maybe further add some meat to it, and you raise a really good point, that it's easy for somebody in the lay public and just human nature who thinks in black and white terms to say, oh, Alan just glorified seed oils and said they're the best thing you can eat. No, let's rewind a little bit far back when really any kind of oil is just reused for refrying and just this repeated oxidation of these oils. That's never a good thing. Okay. Now, for my personal use, my personal go to oil is extra virgin olive oil for most things, whether it's cooking, whether it's dressing foods. Um, Now, another staple oil of mine is sesame oil. Guess what sesame is? It's a freaking seed. Now, if you're skeptical about the fact that we're oversimplifying things, try to find the negative health effects of sesame oil in the literature. Try to find the weight of the evidence showing that you are going to get messed up somehow cardiovascularly or other by sesame oil. Yeah, try. It's even harder to do than trying to find ill effects with canola oil. And the how these things are processed and generated being something of concern is a whole other topic. I mean, people freak out over hexane levels and things like that, not knowing that olive oil generally can have higher hexane levels than the seed oils. That's an inconvenient little fact there. Now, yeah, I don't personally prefer to use corn oil or soybean oil because I like extra virgin olive oil. I like sesame oil. I like coconut oil. I'm not telling people to swap out their favorite oils to, consume soybean and corn oil. I don't like the idea of using cottonseed oil. That's one seed oil that I would not recommend. And if you can minimize it or avoid it, even better. But who on earth do you know is sitting at home chugging down a jug of cottonseed oil? You know? So when you adopt a healthy diet by default, you end up consuming inconsequential amounts of these seed oils that everybody's scared of. And yeah, dude, it was a rant and it was a soapbox, but I appreciate you giving me the platform for that.
Sure. Yeah, and I want to give you that platform because I want people to hear different sides of these things, because unfortunately what most people see and what most people act on is somebody like Flav City going into Costco, picking out a
Oh, that
random
guy.
product on
Oh
a,
man.
on a, in an aisle, and looking at the ingredients list, and like, this has, safflower oil in it, or this has canola oil, and this has X, Y, and Z. And for those reasons, it's not Bobby approved, and you should put this back and fucking wash your mouth out after even, or wash your hands after even picking it up, and it's like people see that. And I think, honestly, at the end of the day, like, I would be more okay with somebody, and this is a utopian perfect world that we will never get to. But if someone like Bobby were to pick up an item in the grocery store, say like Oreos, and they look at the back and they're like, hey guys, you know what? These have a lot of ingredients. They're designed kind of in a factory or in a lab to taste really delicious and to look very visually appealing and to get you to overconsume likely. So you have to keep buying them. And they're not very nutrient rich. They are very nutrient poor. They have a lot of energy in it. They have extra oils that make it more calorie dense. They don't have any fiber. They're very low in protein. For all of those reasons, this product probably isn't something you should be eating a lot of, right? But instead, what you get is they look at it. There's red dye 40. There is carrageenan in it. There's these emulsifiers. There's a natural flavor in it. And to top it off, there's fucking seed oils in it. So you should never look at this product again and buy this thing that I'm affiliated with. And that's kind of the marketing that we see around nutrition nowadays, especially with these influencers who are going around demonizing certain products. And again, that's where people like myself, I know you have problems with, because it's like you said, you know, missing the forest for the fucking weeds that they're just swimming in. And it's frustrating as somebody who might be more evidence based and, you know, puts a lot of context to their responses to some of these things to be oversimplified and dumbed down to the point where you're just scaring the shit out of people and people are acting off of fear. And to me, that's where I have a huge problem. And it's harmful on a lot of levels because it creates a bad relationship with food for a lot of people and not really telling the truth. But for a lot of people who are sitting here who have their shit together, who aren't over consuming calories, who get a lot of these nutrients, who do exercise weekly, like they're seeing this messaging as well. And they're thinking like, fuck, there's another thing that I have to think. I have to look at more food labels. I have to think about this even X amount more times throughout my week where I already am kind of struggling to get all these things in. And again, at best, that's a distraction. And if not, it's leading to behaviors that might be drifting into the unhealthy kind of, you know, category instead of actually improving your health or giving you a good return on your investment. So that's the last thing I'll end on right there.
Well, okay, so I mean that's absolute gold. The last 15 minutes you might want to like cut out like the first part of our talk on flexible dieting so people won't miss this final part after their attention span runs out.
Sure.
But it's like people are not aware that the scientific consensus views animal fats like butter and lard and beef fat with more caution than it does the in quotes seed oils. And that's because the evidence at large indicates that there is a higher level of cardiovascular risk with those type of foods compared to seed oils. So when you search the peer-reviewed literature for why seed oils are bad, you might find like an editorial here and there of a you know of a bit of a wacky author hypothesizing about the potential dangers of seed oils, but the scientific consensus and the weight of the evidence per multiple lines of converging evidence. I'm talking everything from randomized control trials to observational research like prospective cohort studies will show that seed oils as a group are less risky than buttering and larding everything up. So no, I am not on board with the scaremongering about butter and lard and even beef fat. I'm not on board with that either. But it's perfectly okay to point out that, hey, look, you're scaremongering over oils that are somewhere between inert and neutral to actually healthy. And we're looking at seed oils as a group. There was a time in history when hydrogenated vegetable oils were finally recognized to be a harmful thing, like partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. Okay. Those have been banned from the food supply. We don't have to rant about that anymore. That's almost a decade old concern. Um, I've almost gotten to the point where people ask me, who do you listen to in the space? Everybody's saying a different thing. You almost have to say anybody who is vehemently opposed to seed oils and says the oversimplification that seed oils are bad without specifying the type of seed oil, the dose, the context, the health outcome we're talking about, and the literature that they're using to justify that. If somebody, it's just the same as somebody saying dairy is bad. How silly is that of a statement? The same principles apply. And so goes the story with seed oils. And I am going to continue to have my sesame oil, and I am going to continue to, teach people how to try to gain some science literacy and still eat their sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds without fear that that stuff is going to be harming them, when in fact, per the evidence, it's actually going to be doing them some good.
Yep, as you should, man, as you should. And I appreciate all of your time today. I appreciate everything we talked about. I feel like we could have talked for another 2 hours, if that.
Oh, dude, did I just make you blow your next appointment? Oh,
Not
crap.
at all. You're good, dude. You're good. This was far more important
I
than
didn't
what I thought.
realize. I
Uh,
honestly, I lost track, man. I got wrapped up in that.
I'm pumped. I'm pumped. This turned out extremely well. I appreciate your time. I'm going to obviously plug everything, all your info in the show notes, but tell people where they can find you, where they can follow you. If you're not subscribed to Alan's, research review, you're doing yourself a disservice, whether you're a coach or whether you're somebody who just wants to read up on up-to-date research or topics that are coming out. That is a place to go. But tell people where they can find you, where they can communicate with you, and continue to learn from you, because everyone will likely be smarter if they continue to make that a priority.
Oh, thanks, my man. It's alanaragon.com. And I am on Instagram and X and occasionally on Facebook. My Instagram and X handles are the Alan Aragon, so at the Alan Aragon. And yeah, thanks for mentioning my research review. You can find that at alanaragon.com.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate you, man.
You got it.